We got Coach Scott Brisson here on episode 78 of the Fire Coaches podcast, who's an analyst on the football team out at UCLA right now. Got a really unique background, has been at all levels, or what I would consider all levels, being Division III, Division II, and Division I. Was a Division III guy in college. That's how he kind of got his start into coaching as well, too. So, Scott, really can't appreciate you enough for jumping on the podcast tonight.
No, it's mutual. And, like we were talking about, I've been influenced by a lot of people. They probably didn't think they were influencing me at the time, and they did. And I remember what they said and all that. So, like I told you, I don't love doing these things and all that. But if I can help anybody, especially, I think you do a great job. Like I was saying, I think you do a great job talking to guys that are sometimes in some tough spots. And it's a tough business and profession, and I've been on both ends of it. So if I can help anybody, or, that's the mission here.
Yeah, no, I just really appreciate you jumping on and the kind words. So going back in time, and again, you were a D3 athlete around the same time that I was playing football at Bowdoin. Can you kind of talk, I think you're a receiver, talk about, just your experience in that and what kind of elevated you into, coaching college football? Because if I'm not mistaken, I think maybe your senior year at Bowdoin, you guys had like one of the best years like in school history. So just kind of talk about that rise. So I think there's always maybe something there from the athlete standpoint when you're like, hey, I had a piece of something here of changing something. So maybe I can continue to do that down the road.
100%. And we did. We were very fortunate. We had a very connected team. Bowdoin is a very small liberal arts school up in Maine. And I was really just drawn there. I grew up in a very academic oriented family. My mom was a coach. She was the field hockey coach at the local high school. And I really never remembered wanting to do anything other than that, and in fact, my senior year in high school, me and the head coach, it wasn't a very complicated offense, but I called plays really as the quarterback, and most of my senior year, at least the second half, maybe a little bit more, but we would work together.
Early 2000s, that's rare. Yeah. I mean, super rare, even rare today.
It was really cool. And I just got to see another side of it, and we worked together, and we always had these meetings during lunch. I just loved it. I loved that side of it. I loved the preparation. So that really confirmed all I ever wanted to do was coach. And then I was really drawn to Bowdoin. I was very fortunate. My family was I was going to go to the best school that I got into. So that was Bowdoin College. And I was really drawn there by the head coach. His name's Dave Caputi. He's currently at Middlebury College, but just an unbelievable mentor for me. I mean, he loved football. He loves his family. His kids were always there. His son, when I was playing, was very young. He was always in the office running around. In fact, he ended up playing quarterback for him years later. But that's what I wanted to be. He was so obsessed with football, and I wanted that, and I didn't really care where it was, but I wanted to be like Coach Caputi. I wanted to be obsessed with football. So I lived in the office as a college player, and he let me. They didn't have GAs at Bowdoin College, so I did a lot of GA type stuff, and that never dissuaded me. I think he tried to. He even apologized to my dad when I graduated. He's like, "I'm sorry you spent all this money for Scott to be a coach." I couldn't talk him out of it, but he was transformative for me. And like I said, that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be obsessed with football and offense and have my family around, and it just being an all encompassing deal. So that's where it all started. We were very fortunate, my class and the one below us. At the high academic small schools, you don't always have a lot of kids that love football. They have a lot of kids that were good at football and very talented across the board, but you maybe didn't always have a ton of kids that were motivated each day but we did. In my class, we did, and in the class below us. And because of that, my senior year, we were able to win a lot of really close games at a place that had not had a lot of success. And that's why we were very connected. We were very, very connected. We had a very connected team. And then after I left, they continued to have some success. And and that's how it all, kind of came to fruition.
So did Coach Caputi get you connected to Franklin and Marshall then, or how did that all come about?
What ended up happening, yes, to a degree, when I was a sophomore, we had a coach on staff named Craig Sutyak. He left to go to Fordham. But then I don't remember what happened at Fordham, but then he became the defensive coordinator at Franklin and Marshall. And when I was a senior, Coach Caputi certainly helped me, as did another coach, Tom Radulski. They called everybody They thought it was important that I work at a different school besides Bowdoin, which I agree with,
Which again, I mean, that's awesome on their part, right? I mean, they could
Yeah,
easily been like, "Hey, this guy's been great for us." Like,
exactly. And but I think knowing myself, and especially who was in that rising senior class, it probably would have been difficult to, coach them at the level, necessary. So they called everybody that they could for me. And the best fit was at Franklin and Marshall College. And so Craig helped orchestrate that. And, again, overall, like, this is probably going to be the same message. I've just worked for incredible people. I've just worked for, I've just been so lucky with the head coaches that I've been around. And John Troxel is certainly one of them. He's now the head coach at Lafayette, but I was fortunate to be on his first staff at F&M, and it was amazing. And everybody says this, and probably in every profession, but I loved football. Nobody loved football more than me. It was amazing being in those rooms about how you realize how little you actually know,
sure.
and, just listening to Trox, and then especially in my second year, our ROC, RJ Ryan, I was like, man, I don't know anything, that these guys are, and I just wanted to absorb everything that I could. I think that's a great benefit of those types of jobs, that the staffing is so small. There was only 5 of us that were in the office every day. You just get to add value. You just get to, do at whatever job, even if you're not ready for it or even good at it. And, you get to grow in those roles. So I was fortunate to land at F&M with, again, another group of really, really great people.
No, there's something I think almost, a podcast in itself could be, and regardless of sport, but talking about that transition from being a college athlete to a coach, when you're like, oh, even if you weren't a good player, like I was not, I was a very average college basketball player at the Division III level. But you come into it thinking like, oh, I have so much to give and so much to teach these people. And you realize really quick that you're like, well, I'm way over my skis here. Like, I really don't know what I'm talking about, and obviously we'll talk about your Lehigh experience, but kind of tying in the Division III with Franklin and Marshall, St. Lawrence, Lycoming. You were offensive coordinator. You won some conference titles, if I'm not mistaken, between St. Lawrence and Lycoming. So, just talk about like the D3 experience in itself. And I know that was spread out a little bit over time, but you going from being a student athlete to running offenses, winning conference championships, and, in a pretty short amount of time, just kind of what was that like at that level when obviously, again, people who maybe haven't been there don't understand, what it takes and even from a recruiting standpoint, but like we were talking about off air, how big you are into the scheme and just schematic type stuff.
Well, it's important to know at St. Lawrence, especially too, like I've moved a lot here in the last 5 years. So anytime you move, you kind of look back on, the stuff you have accumulated, and coaches are kind of hoarders, of stuff. And I look back on my notebooks from St. Lawrence and all that. I mean, it's unbelievable that we had any success, actually. Honestly, I mean, I just could not believe what was in some of those notebooks as far as things.
So are you looking back that you're like, wow, I didn't know anything?
Yeah, correct.
Is that what kind of
I think during that time, we were having some success. And I worked for an unbelievable guy named Mark Raymond, who let me grow in that job. He really did. I mean, I just look back and cringe sometimes about some of the stuff we were doing.
I'm going to stop you right there for a second. I don't like interrupting guests.
Yep.
But I think because I mean, same with my podcast, right? I listened to the first 50 even here, and you literally cringe at how you sound or the quality.
Yeah.
But I also am trying to flip that and be like, well, maybe that's how much I've grown though too.
Absolutely.
And I've changed. So you can look at it both ways, right?
Absolutely. And I feel like I'm the latter. I feel like maybe at the time, especially we won the first league title in a long, long time there. My first year as the coordinator, we had a great defense, and I thought Coach Raymond did an unbelievable job. He was so competitive. He's so competitive. He's the head coach at Williams College now. And he was his authentic self to the team. And I think the team adopted that, and I adopted that. That really resonated with me. And he just let me grow and make mistakes. And I made a ton of them. And we would go for a walk every Friday. I don't know if he remembers this, but it was, I always looked forward to it, even though a lot of it was correction of me,
Are you saying that's before a game or just even during the year?
Yep. Yeah. Mostly before, every once in a while during the year. But,
okay.
Before a game, we would go on a walk, around campus, and we would talk about the game. He would talk about thoughts as far as how I managed the previous game or mismanaged it in some cases. and I just grew so much,
But he wasn't
from.
blowing you up in front of people, right? I
No,
mean, just a very
absolutely not.
like,
He
yeah.
never did. He never did. And he could have a bunch of times. And he coached me. He coached the coaches and he did a phenomenal job of that. And I'd like to think that I grew a lot from there, even though he wasn't the beneficiary of it in his program. But I certainly grew up a lot. I thought I was a hot shot. It was only my fourth year coaching and I got an OC job. And I wasn't. We had great kids. We had a great defense. We had an unbelievable head coach. And honestly, kind of won in spite of the offensive coordinator, all kidding aside. I don't know that I always put us in the best position to be successful, looking back on that time. So we were fortunate there. And then, you know, and this has happened to me a handful of times. A lot of times when you're kind of resigned, and I don't mean resigned as a negative, when you're saying, hey, I'm here next year, I'm not looking for anything. A lot of times that's when jobs have popped open, for me for whatever reason. And that happened. So we finished our second year at St. Lawrence, and a guy I had gotten to know, Mike Clark, he was the head coach and AD at Lycoming. They were kind of on the other end of the spectrum where we were building St. Lawrence. Lycoming was already kind of built and they were looking to, take the next step in a very, very competitive league. And the offensive coordinator, who is now one of my best friends, Chris Monfiletto, he works for us here at UCLA as well. He left to go be the head coach at Kenyon College. And Coach Clark called me up. He was very close with John Troxel, who I worked for at Franklin and Marshall. And he's like, hey, I have this opportunity. So we talked about it and it was great. It checked a lot of boxes. And so I was able to go to Lyco and we had a very good, very productive 2-year stint there, as well.
That's awesome. I feel like, I love this episode so much already because you've mentioned Middlebury, you mentioned Williams, you mentioned Kenyon. I mean, we're like
Yep.
checking off the D3 things. And again, just
Yep.
hearing like about these people, whether they were coaches you coached under or people you would consider mentors. I mean, just the ability to get you involved at such a young age, to pass
Yep.
you along, to allow you to fail. And just like, again, this is stuff that I feel like was, again, there's people out there that struggle with this from a coaching standpoint at all levels to give coaches the control or the ability to fail, right, and learn from
Yep.
mistakes. So I feel like you got a lot at a young age. I feel like that was awesome. And obviously Lehigh, you were there over a couple different stints. Talk about because you went to Lehigh, but then you also did some Division III stuff as well after that. But talk about your first stint as a GA
Yep.
at Lehigh and kind of getting that experience before you went to St. Lawrence and to
Yeah.
Lycoming.
Absolutely. And those jobs were great. They've changed a little bit since that time, but those jobs were great because you were a GA. Like you had all the GA duties. You had to do all those things that GAs do, but you also coached a position and you had an on the road recruiting area. So while you were expected to be a GA and do those types of things that they do, you also had the expectations of a full-time position coach. And those jobs were fantastic. And I worked for one of the best men, honestly, that's ever lived, Andy Cohen. He's passed away. I get always choked up about him, but he's recently passed away. But it was great. I coached the running backs, which I hadn't had much run game experience at that point. I worked, really closely with the O-line coach, Brett Sawyer, and learned a ton. So I did that and really grew. And that up to that point, that was the highest level of football I'd been at. And football was very important at Lehigh. It was very important to win there. And there were some expectations there and I really loved it. And then, going back to this opportunity came up at St. Lawrence. And I was a little bit hesitant about it. I certainly wanted to be a coordinator, but I was having such a great experience at Lehigh. And so Coach Cohen called me into his office and he's like, what's the end game? What do you want to do? And I was like, well, I really want to be a full-time coach at Lehigh. I love it here. And he's like, well, you have to take this job then, because that would have given me, 10 years worth of experience, which it did, being a coordinator and making mistakes and doing all that. So it wasn't like he promised, but it was like, all right, go do this. And before I can hire you back. And then that's what happened. So I was a coordinator at St. Lawrence and Lyco for 4 years. And then, true to his word.
Was that 2014 when you came back?
Correct.
Yeah.
So, Dave Cicchini, who had been the OC and done a fantastic job there, he got the head job at Valpo and took a lot of the staff. There was a little bit of a staff shakeup, there. So really, true to his word, I mean, it was really the first opportunity on offense to hire a full-time coach since I had left, and he hired me back. So he hired me back as the receiver coach and the recruiting coordinator. And yeah, and then I spent, a lot of time at Lehigh, after that, and a lot of different jobs and a lot of different circumstances.
Give somebody who's maybe listening here, let's say they're a basketball coach, not a football guy. Obviously Lehigh in the Patriot League, and like you said, they're serious about football. They wanted to win. Compare that to, and I know Division III and FCS football is completely different, but just compare that difference, like you were talking about when you were a GA there, or even why you wanted to get back, of, just kind of what that level was like compared to being at a Division III level.
Yeah, it was the all day focus on football because, and better than anyone, at Division III, when your staff is small, you get pulled in a million different ways, and you really have to set aside time and be a master of budgeting your time well, to do the smaller college stuff well on the field or on the court. And that's what I loved at Lehigh is, it was the biggest staff I had ever been on. They had tremendous success. The offensive coordinator, Trey Brown, is a great mentor and friend, dear friend to this day. I just loved just going to work. You might, the off season, I have a good friend of mine that says I usually can't wait for the season to end so I can watch what everybody else was doing. And there is some truth to that, like those were in the DVD days, and Trey would get these packages of DVDs from, I think one of his buddies out west, maybe at Stanford or something like that. So that's when Oregon was starting to take off and all these teams, and USC was unbelievable on offense. So Oklahoma, I mean, I remember just being in heaven.
It's like being a big video game guy and waiting for a video game to release kind of thing, right?
Exactly. So this huge box would come in and Trey would open it up, and it was like, it was like Christmas, like, oh my God, and now, but whatever, that was, really the experience is just, you were around a lot of like-minded people. There was a lot more of them. You could talk a lot more football and all that. And, at a place that had, real expectations. And that was the case at Lycoming too. There was expectations there as well. But I mean, you know how it is a lot of times, and I don't mean this any other way, but some of these Division III jobs that just get the kids through school, make sure it's a positive experience and all that. And I'm not minimizing that.
No,
That's absolutely,
everyone's
but
different.
yeah, sometimes the expectations are that it's this kid needs to have a positive experience. If you guys win some games along the way, great. But if not, this is about producing, men and having a positive experience. And I felt for the first time that results were, at least on par, with some of those other discussions.
Yeah, I think it was 2017 you became the OC.
Yeah.
At Lehigh, and you coached Troy Pelletier, who was a Walter Payton finalist.
Yeah.
I believe it was 2019 you guys led the Patriot League in passing, and you started 3 different quarterbacks that year. I mean, obviously you guys did some really special stuff. Just kind of talk about the growth, from that program, but also your standpoint. Like you're talking about being a big scheme guy and being able to dive into these DVDs and different types of stuff like that. I mean, obviously you had a lot of success as your time as an OC at Lehigh.
So what I learned quickly. So when I got hired back at Lehigh, Drew Fulmer was the offensive coordinator. He's the head coach at Millersville currently. And he led the offensive staff. It was extremely collaborative. There were no lanes. It wasn't like the receiver coach, you talked about third down passing, and the O-line coach, he's got there were no lanes. Anybody could talk about anything. And in that environment, I think me and the offensive line coach, Andy Marino, I think we really grew a lot and really enjoyed that. And then we had a great year in 2016. We won the league. I think we won 9 or 10 games in a row. We were very prolific offensively. And Drew had an opportunity to go to Elon and work with Kurt Signetti as the offensive coordinator there. And it was a great job. And so I got promoted, and I wanted to do the exact same thing. I wanted to run the room the exact same way. And we had a lot of really good players on offense. We were really, really good. We were returning a lot of experience and a lot of production. And we pretty much just ran the system we had been running, because they knew it. I love studying as much as anybody, but I was smart enough to realize, like, all right, let's not go too far away from what we were doing and just stay out of these kids' way. And I think for the most part, that's what we did. And we had it was a weird year because the Patriot League was much smaller back then. So you had to play 1 million out of conference games, and we struggled in them. We were scoring points, but we were not winning. And then we got in the league play, and we won 6 in a row, and ended up winning the league title, and then playing an unbelievable defense in Stony Brook in the first round of playoffs. But anyways, that was the thing. Like, you knew you had good players. Make sure our best players are affecting the game in a positive way, and just kind of stay out of their way. And I knew that was the case, but then when all those guys were gone, shortly after, we really started to struggle. And there were some other factors at play in the program at that time that were, it was just a tough period of time on a lot of different fronts. And, so at that point, I was probably, and again, going back to growth areas, I think this is one looking back on it that I wish I did a better job of, is recognizing we can't run the same system that I did with Troy or whoever. We had so many great players: Don Bragalone, Brad Mays. I'm Zach Duffy. Like, I'm going to forget it.
Brad Mays was your quarterback, right?
Brad Mays was a quarterback. Yep. And we just had so many great players, and any offense would have worked, honestly. And I think what I wish I had a chance to do in 2019, 2020, the kind of that era, I just wish I changed more. Whereas I was like, hey, this is our system, let's teach the system, you'll grow within the system. What I wish I did in hindsight was, be a little bit more exotic, I guess, for lack of a better term, and challenge defenses, a little bit more thinking wise pre-snap than I did. And while I had a great run at Lehigh, I met my wife there, my son was born, when we were there. The downside of being there so long is, even though I was studying people, I wasn't growing. I didn't grow as much as I could have by being exposed to other places and other people. We had transition, and we would hire people, and I would invariably ask them what they were doing, and we would implement some or a lot of it. But I was still me, you know what I mean? It was still my mindset and all that. And my pushback was always, well, he's young, we'll just grow him in the system. And we should have done, I'm not saying everything, but we should have done more to challenge, kids mentally on the field from a defensive standpoint. And I don't know how it got on that tangent, but
no, but I think that's actually real, because you talk about, we always have this conversation in the basketball world. Like, do you recruit to a program of a style the way we play, or do you just get the best kids and you just figure it out, right? And there's obviously many different ways to skin a cat, but I think, like, when you have success like that and you're like, hey, let's just stay out of the kids' way and keep this way, to me, it's like, you look back and it's like, well, hindsight's 20/20, right? And I also honestly appreciate that you look back and you're like, hey, this is, because so many people, I think, in our coaching world just get, one onto the next thing. And actually, I shared a podcast that Chris Peterson had done back last August that I think is phenomenal, where he's just like, so many people are like, well, I don't have time for this, I don't have time for that. I mean, you're just always on the go. And so I really appreciate that you've reflected on that, because again, that is like a tough thing, right? Like, you could have went the other way and done all the exotic stuff and then really got it off course. And you're like, well, if we'd have just stayed, right? Like, it's one of those things that it's like, who knows, 100%. Right?
And it's probably somewhere in between, but that was the area I wish I grew more. I didn't have the success. I was the offensive coordinator on a very, very successful offense. And again, up until that point, I had really experienced mostly success, in these roles. So, I was involved in a couple of things. I had, bigger jobs that I didn't end up getting, but I was like, I'm kind of on this track. And I knew this. It's not like this completely blindsided me. But then, you mentioned Troy, but Troy was unbelievable. Troy was obsessed with football. You just loved being around him from that standpoint. But we had a lot of guys like that, and that's why we were good. And then when they were gone, I wasn't as good, and that was a very, very lonely feeling. And like I said, I wish, even though Lehigh was great to me, and again, that 10 years over 2 stints is a long, long period of time, but sometimes it is good, even if it's a great place, sometimes it is good to get out of there and go experience, something else, in another way to think, which, even though it wasn't my choice, that happened and I'm better for it, because of it. So there's one thing I could say, to someone, hopefully the younger guys maybe on here or whatever, that you need to be humble, I think, in this thing. And there needs to be a lot of humility. And I think the best coaches that I've been around are there's a lot of humility to them. There's not one way to do any one thing,
Sure.
My boss right now, every person that visits here, he asks them, hey, what can we do better? And this
Like if
is a
they
guy
watch a
that took,
practice or whatever kind
yeah,
of thing. Yeah.
yeah. And I tell them, I've had a couple people visit both JMU and here. I'm like, look, at some point, I don't know when, but the head coach is going to grab you and he's going to say, what can we do better here? What are we doing well? And what can we do better? And he's going to want a real answer. And they laugh. I'm like, no, I'm serious. Like you
Yeah.
need to, look at this with a critical eye. Uh, and I mean, and that's how he is. And that's why he's had so much success. And I think the best people I've been around in this business at every stage, have that quality.
Yeah. So, you talked about kind of the end of it, end of 22, Coach Gilmore had resigned. Like, what do you
Yeah,
remember from, obviously, again, right? Fire Coaches podcast, obviously, things end, again, for many coaches. But
yeah,
what do you remember from that finality of like, okay, I got to go find something different, which ends up being offensive coordinator, Division II, Shippensburg for Packer fans, John Kuhn's alma mater. But
absolutely.
what do you remember about that? Just that transition and just the craze of it all.
It was tough. I felt like I had, even though we weren't having success, I had invested everything I had into Lehigh, as did Coach Gilmore. He took over during a really, really, really tough stretch in Lehigh's period, and he's not given enough credit for, steering us through not only that, but also the COVID period. I mean, he did
Oh
an
yeah,
amazing job, during that. So he invested everything. That was his dream job. It didn't go the way any of us expected for a variety of reasons. So, number one, I felt awful for him. I knew it was time, whether we were forced to leave or, maybe ideally for Coach Gilmore, he would be retained and maybe forced to change the coordinator. I would have been fine with that, would have completely understood that. And if nothing happened, then I knew that I had to leave. Like it had just reached that point.
sure.
So it was in some ways liberating, so I knew something was going to happen. I kind of got out ahead of it just because I just couldn't envision waiting. I couldn't
Mhm.
envision waiting for the other shoe to drop. And what ended up happening was obviously Lehigh made a change. So, I would have, been let go anyway. But what it allowed me the opportunity to do was, like you mentioned, I did some self-reflecting, but yeah, an opportunity came up in Shippensburg, and this was amazing. So I had interviewed for the Shippensburg OC about 10 years prior, and the head coach, Mark Macheski, he told me, he's like, you're not ready. You're not ready for this. You got to have another good year, and you'll be ready. And he was I don't know how he figured it out, but he was 100% right. So I went back to Lyco. We had a really good year, and he was 100% right. So because of that, I just respected him so much. We kind of stayed in touch, not frequently, but once or twice a year, I would hear from him or I would stay in touch with him. So we kind of had this relationship, for 8 or 10 years. The job came open. I felt like it was the right time, now, and it was a place that I respected immensely. I respected him immensely. The league is great. So I jumped at the opportunity. Like I saw that the job came open. I was like, I had all my friends reach out to him. Anyone that knew him reached out to them on my behalf. I reached out to him. I was like, Coach, I want this job. I'm ready. And I love Ship. I think he's a fantastic head coach and he's just an unbelievable family oriented person. And I wanted the job, and I was fortunate enough to be offered the job. And to me, it was a no brainer to take that. So, indebted to him, but that was certainly a rough time, but I did feel kind of, I was excited to go somewhere else. I really was. I was excited to move on and do something else. I'm sure it was mutual. Yeah, I'm sure the people at Lehigh felt the same. And, I thought it led to some really cool, things in the next few years.
Going back to your reflection, do you feel that's, again, like you said, your upbringing, obviously there was a heavy educational piece there. Was it you as a person, or do you think it was that time where you're like, you were doing some heavy reflecting at that point, even kind of going into that moment where it was like, hey, what do I need to do different? What's next for me? Or was it just situational? Like that happened, I had to start figuring it out of what I want to do.
A little of both, a little of both. As the season certainly, and it wasn't a complete surprise. I didn't think we would fall off the cliff quite like that, but I knew it would be a rebuilding type of year. And I felt like I was, and I think the people that know me well would verify this about that period of time. I felt like as that 22 season was going on, I was working harder and harder and getting, you know, diminishing results, both with me, my personal life, my family life, every relationship I had. I just felt everything was going the wrong way. And we weren't having on the field success. I'm sure like I said, I'm sure I could have done and should have done a better job, but that was kind of going on. Um, it wasn't like overwhelming, but I was certainly
No, but
having
you're
those
like, there's different triggers going up. Like, hey, something's going to change.
right.
Yeah.
Like for years, I was like, oh, I'm good. I'm not going to leave here. It was a great situation. And then that season, it was certainly kind of heading that way, or some of these thoughts are starting to cross your mind. Like, okay, what would I do next? What would, and you're starting to talk to people and all that. So yeah, that's kind of how it went. It was natural, it was kind of an organic process, of reflection. Like I knew, I'm smart enough to realize if you're the coordinator of a bad offense on a bad team, you're going to be held responsible. And I could make all the reasons why that was happening, some of which were very true and very valid, but ultimately I was the coordinator of an offense that was struggling to have success. And, at some point, the finger was going to get, pointed at me, whether that was fair or not. I thought I worked really hard. The kids knew I worked really hard. The staff knew I worked really hard. It just, at that point, I think had kind of run its course. And I knew it was time. I knew it was time. I didn't know what was next or what the next role would be, but I knew it was certainly getting to that point, as that season was unfolding.
So in 24, you're an analyst and I think an assistant quarterback coach at Wake Forest.
Yeah.
Coach Dave Clausen's last year there.
Yeah.
You get to another spot and, we were kind of talking off air about, being at the highest level and kind of finding a good fit there. And then all of a sudden, obviously it's Coach Clausen's last year. So again, like and I've had this conversation with other guests before. I know just from talking to people, it doesn't get easier when things are changing constantly. But was there any point where you're like, well, hey, like I've already done this a few times, like let's just keep going, or kind of where did that mindset get at where after that year at Wake, Coach Clausen steps down?
It was shocking. And I would have stayed in that role with that for Coach Clausen and Coach Ruggiero. I mean, I would have stayed there forever. I loved it. I loved every day there. I felt almost guilty how much I was getting from them. Like, am I adding the value that I'm getting back from just listening? I really think Coach Ruggiero is the best offensive coordinator in the country. I believe that with every fiber of my being. And I was getting so much from that experience. I just felt so fortunate to be there. And so that certainly, blindsided me a little bit. And I was devastated because I loved Wake. I loved it there. My wife loved it there. It was just a great fit on so many levels. But I know that I had certainly extracted everything out of it that I could. I learned from, again, what I feel is the best in the country, and it's just like every time. I mean, there was rarely a day that went by where I wasn't like, oh I'm the biggest idiot in the world for not thinking of that, and he was just so sharp. He's so sharp and so concise, and he's just such a good coach. It was amazing. It was an amazing experience. It was transformative in a lot of ways. So, if you told me I was going to have that job for 10 years, I would have been thrilled, that's how much I enjoyed it. But there was, certainly a point, so the new head coach came in and let us go. And we had a little bit of severance, not much, but I think it was about 6 weeks or so where, all right, at least, I can,
There's
if I'm
something,
at
right?
home,
Yeah.
exactly. So I was like, something will pop up, in 6 weeks, even though I had still kind of held out hope that, something might exist at Wake Forest. But what I found, and this was amazing, and I've told this to a million young coaches now since this, and I wish I did this. I was an out of work coach and I was reaching out to people asking them for a job, which yields almost no results. Those conversations like, yeah, send your resume, and they kind of blow you off if you get in touch with anybody at all. And I just started to then, all right, I'm going to work on a job from like whatever, 7 to 12. And then I'm going to have lunch, and then I'm going to work on football from 1 to 5. That was kind of like how I organized my day. What would I change? I learned so much at Wake. I'd be an idiot to just put it in a bin somewhere and never circle back. So I kind of rebuilt everything, what I would do, in the afternoons. And then I still had access. There's a thing called PFF. So I still had access through my Wake Forest account. So I was watching PFF. I was watching everybody, trends, everything like that. What I ended up finding was, I would reach out to coaches about, hey, I saw this screen, you guys ran. Well, boom, he gets right back to you, because they'll talk to you about that. They don't
Right.
want to,
They want
they
a
don't want
different
to talk to you about,
outside
yeah.
experience, and like, hey, what's your thoughts on this then?
So like my hit rate on talking to guys about scheme and not asking them for a job, it was like night and day. I was like, I should have been doing this 20 years ago, as far as like networking. I think networking has a bad connotation to it. I don't mean like running around, and looking at logos and all that. I mean like building relationships based on
Offering real
mutual
feedback,
respect.
and yeah.
Exactly. And I didn't, in my opinion, I didn't do enough of that, looking back on how easy it was during that period of time to get a hold of coordinators, get a hold of head coaches, if you just wanted to talk football and not ask them for something. So, that was that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Like, I do it now all the time because I love it. But I should have been doing that when I was at Franklin and Marshall, and those types of things. So that was a tough period of time. My wife had a great job, so I was very lucky there, where once our severance ended, we weren't destitute by any means. And then this opportunity popped open late at James Madison, and I had a couple other things going on, but Coach Chesney was at Holy Cross when I was at Lehigh, and you saw from
That's what I
across
was
the
wondering. I was
field.
wondering the symmetry between D3 and
Yep.
that Holy Cross and Lehigh and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, so you just couldn't. You knew all the kids that they recruited at Holy Cross. We recruited all the same kids. They just looked different. They played different, and everything would have to go perfect for you to win against Holy Cross. On those days, it really did. And then, so I had the opportunity, to hook on with him and the offensive coordinator, Dean Kennedy. And as soon as you're in the building, you realize like this is different, and I get why they had so much success. It almost has nothing to do with the game. The game was won, the game was often won or lost. Well, it always is. But, with him and how he creates this culture, and that word gets thrown around a lot, but there was a real culture. There was a real culture. You could feel it when you walked in the building at JMU. And that's certainly what we're trying to build here. But that was amazing. So again, I kind of look back, and that's why, I wanted to do this, because I think I've had some really unique experiences, especially the last 4 or 5 years, where I really feel that Coach Chesney is the best head coach in the country. I really feel that Warren Ruggiero is the best OC in the country. And I had an opportunity to work for both of them, in the later stages of your career. So, that has just been, I've just been incredibly fortunate, to hook on with him, at JMU.
So what is it about Coach Chesney's call? Is it just that everyone's valued? I mean, like you mentioned, people visiting practice, and he's honestly looking for legit feedback of positives and negatives. Like, I mean, again, not to, right. I've seen enough stuff on Twitter, and you can see some of these videos that come across, and he just seems very authentic. And obviously, again, to take over what obviously Signetti had left, to then him putting his own stamp and doing something of getting in the college football playoff. I mean, obviously, he's got to be a culture builder. So just what is it about him?
He is. So you hit the nail on the head. Everything is important. Everything at all times is important. The way the building was set up at JMU, it basically took up the end zone. His office, our 2 offices were actually the complete opposite ends of the building. So like it wouldn't be unusual. In season's different, but out of the season, it wouldn't be unusual for me to sometimes not see him for most of the day or day. Anyways, you pass him in the hall and he's like, hey, Briss, I need you to look up UConn's nakeds. And, when they motion in number, like he just has that on the tip of your tongue, and
Like it's a to-do list, and he's just got it right there.
Yeah. I'm like, holy cow. Like if we didn't how long are you going to hold on to that
Yeah.
before we
You're gonna
cross
text
that?
me, you're gonna email me, like
It's unbelievable. It's never like, "Hey, coach, how's it going?" There's always something meaningful, being conveyed, and the way he does it, at least with me, I can't say for everybody, but at least with me, there's a lot of urgency, and it feels like, all right, if you don't get this done at an elite level, you're letting him down. And I don't think he means for it to come across that way, but he creates a lot of urgency in the building, by operating that way. And his mind is so multi-track. I just I don't know how he does that. I don't know. There's been a million times where I've saw somebody and like, oh, I wish I said that. And like, he's just always got everything ready to go. But the other thing, I think his number one strength, and a lot of people ask me about him, but the number one strength he has is he's able to pick the right people. He's able to pick the right kids that he wants in the program. He's able to pick the right staff. And however he goes about his evaluation standpoint from a character standpoint, it's the way it should be done, because the kids at JMU were unbelievable. Like, so people say culture has nothing to do. We have some core tenets of our program, that come up a lot, but those kids aren't motivated by a saying on a t-shirt. Like, the culture is how we do it. This is how we do this. This is the expectation. And we had so many kids in that on that JMU team that were brand new. Like, that's what, people don't realize is, you know, each of his 2 years, and Coach Signetti had to do the same, but each of his 2 years, he had to make pretty much a brand new team. And like, it's just amazing that you're able to build that culture that quickly, but he's able to pick the right people. However, he gets the information that he needs to decide if you're somebody he wants in his organization. In my short time with him, he has rarely missed. And you get a lot of people like that are like-minded, that have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They went all in. The kids were unbelievable. I can't tell you what it felt like being in the building every single day. And it's because he got the right people. He got the right people in there. And then you get the right people all sitting there. All right, here's the path. This is what, these are the expectations. This is what we have to do. They ate it up. They bought in. They would do anything that we asked of them to the best of their ability.
culture aside, do you think, like your experience at Lehigh, his at Holy Cross, I think he was at John Hopkins at one point.
Yeah,
Do you think working at, some of these schools where maybe, again, you don't have as much funding as you like, or it's really high standards to get in the door, do you think that has
yeah,
helped, in terms of whether it's James Madison or what you guys are doing at UCLA now, where it's like, we don't have all these certain restrictions, and UCLA I know is a great school, but maybe you don't have all these certain restrictions, but still, like, we're going to recruit a certain type of kid because that's just kind of what we're used to?
absolutely. And he talks about all the time, a degree of separation. Like, you can't be a great player and a below average student. At worst, you have to be a good student. You know what I mean? So you
Hmm.
can't be all up here on one and then the rest of your life is a mess. And he's been at places, and I've heard him talk about some of his mentors in the past, particularly at Johns Hopkins, where Johns Hopkins, I mean, anywhere you turn, there's an elite person, standing there. You know what I mean? In whatever field they're in, whether they're a professor, whether they're a student, whether they're a coach, you know, Holy Cross is the same way. UCLA is the same way. I mean, I didn't even know it was the type of school it was until, this thing started going on. I mean, it's one of the best schools in the world. It's the top public institution in the country. There's CEOs here. There's going to be president. Like, there's just high achievers everywhere you look, and he thrives in those environments. And, I think he feels strongly, and a lot of people do, but I think he feels strongly that great football players are great people. He doesn't talk to our players about being players. They're people
Hmm.
first, and he treats them that way. And, so he gets those people. He presents, this is what we're after. This is what UCLA is about, or wherever he was at. He presents that to people, and people that are wired the right way eat that up, and they thrive here. They thrive in these situations. So, he says it all the time. You can have it all here at UCLA. You can have it all, in these types of places that he's been lucky. JMU, same
Yeah.
way.
So talk about, again, your tough time. It ends at Lehigh. You get, to a spot where Wake Forest, you finally feel comfortable. Family's good there. And then you go on this opposite swing where you get a James Madison, you guys go on that crazy run. I think the
Yep.
only, loss in the regular season was Louisville, a 14-point game, but late you beat Coastal on the road, you beat Troy in the championship, you go to play Oregon, and now you make this move to UCLA. You're on the West Coast for being an East
Yep.
Coast guy for your whole life. Like, just talk about like that swing from one side to all of a sudden like this side of things.
Well, a lot of the day to day is very recognizable, because you're seeing, everything we're talking about, you see on a daily basis. I've seen these things at JMU. I saw him as an opponent, when he was at Holy Cross and I was at Lehigh. So a lot of it is recognizable, and it's been really neat to be a part of year one with him, as well. Even though year two at JMU, like I said, that was a new team,
Sure.
pretty much. So, but it's been neat watching this and being a part of this from the ground up. So, honestly, like all kidding aside, it's the traffic and the expense around here. Like outside of that, I don't feel like it's that much different because we're around a lot of like-minded people that are after the same mission, and we have a lot of help and alignment and resources. This place wants to be really, really good at football. Everybody else is really good here in their sport. There's a lot of national titles and national title contenders and all that. So everybody wants to help. And so from that standpoint, and I don't mean to minimize it, but from that standpoint, it's really not all that different. There's certainly a lot of familiar faces here. The ones that are new have been incredible fits, both players and staff. And, I think it's really just kind of picking up the thing and putting it up in a place like UCLA that you can have everything here. You absolutely can. So it's not my wife might have a different opinion of how much it's changed, but to me, the day to day has not changed a great deal.
Well, and you talk about how much, we were talking off air, how much you love the scheme and, being an analyst the last few years between Wake and JMU and now UCLA, you really get to focus on ball, which is what you love. Obviously, we talked about a lot about reflection. Is there any other ways that you look to get better, whether it's books, podcasts, any type of stuff, or is it just connecting with coaches and literally talking different schemes and what's new out there and what maybe we can layer in our offense or whatever else?
All of it. I mean, honestly, yes to everything that you just said. There's so much information available, out there that, yeah, I mean, I'm obsessed with it. In fact, our DC just put me on to another podcast, that's kind of scheme oriented. I usually listen, to that on the way home, when you're stuck in traffic. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm trying to do what I said I would, where you're talking to people. We have a little bit more. That is one thing that is a little bit different. I think we have a little bit more access, to people. Certainly people are intrigued by Coach Chesney as well. And they come into the building and we make sure that we download their information, as well, especially if they're having a lot of success, if they want to come visit, hopefully it's more of a mutual give and take. So, yeah, yes to all of that. It's a great place and a great location where you have access to a lot of resources and, you're an idiot to not try to take advantage of those.
Well, Coach Brisson, I really appreciate you sitting down. I know it's 5 o'clock on the West Coast right now, so traffic's probably just heating up. So hopefully
I
we
don't
can
know
get.
when it starts and when it ends. It just
I know.
always seems.
I don't know either. All I know is that, our west of Green Bay here, we got to worry about a little road construction with one lane. That's
Yep.
about all we got. So,
Yep.
no, honestly, I really appreciate you sitting down. I mean, having Coach Wackenheim and Coach Ambrose on here talking FCS levels, and obviously you spent a lot of time at Lehigh. Just been fun to kind of get to know you guys and talk about your past and things like that. So, really appreciate you taking some time to sit down. It's been fun. I think there's a lot of nuggets in here for young coaches as well, too, as older ones.
I hope so. And again, I just try to pass along anything, I've learned. And like I said, man, some of the best opportunities, even though they came out of bad situations or on the heels of bad situations, have been amazing and transformative for me. So, I think that that's an important message and one that, I probably learned a little too late in this deal. So
Got a lot of
hopefully,
miles left. Got a lot of miles
no
left.
doubt. So I
Well, thanks for
appreciate it.
joining.
Thank you, Coach. This is great.